This is episode we can't actually be bothered to look it up, and we're going to be talking about Canadian politics. Well, talking isn't quite the right word for it.
Bantering?
Yeah, discussing, analyzing, looking into, desperately trying to wring some kind of meaning out of the absolute and utter mess that is Canadian politics.
I don't know if I'd call it an utter mess. It's pretty, there's so many divisions, but I would say it's a lot more orderly and not as much of a perpetual shit show as our southern borders. The Americans would, I don't know, is that unfair to say?
Well, honestly, you could talk about this, you could talk about the American political system forever, and it wouldn't matter. They're unchangeable. But here, things happen in like a couple of weeks, and parties that have been in power for 50 years suddenly disappear, and crazy things can happen.
Yeah, that's true. We do have an election coming up on October 27th. Sorry, 22nd. 27th is my birthday. So we're going to do a couple of episodes on the Canadian politics and maybe follow the election as it goes on.
You know, pontificate, prevaricate, etc.
Sure. Hopefully, I don't really want to jinx it, but I really hope this is the year that we finally kick Stephen Harper out of power. However...
Come on, he's getting on in years. The man's probably going to retire after the next election either way.
Sure, but what I meant is, I was, a few months ago, we were here in BC all saying, oh, finally we'll get rid of the Liberals. Oh, the polls are all on our side, and, surely this will be the day. And we got fucking obliterated in the polls. And it was the most depressing shit ever. So I'm not going to, hold my breath, but I'm definitely going to help out on Election Day.
Hope will carry you through.
Yeah. Well, it got Obama elected, so...
Twice, even.
Yeah.
And that's at least one more than he probably deserves.
Yes. Well, in any event...
And hey, here in Canada, we have nothing but a series of good reasons why term limits should be put in place. We can have the same prime minister for 10 years, 20 years, forever, who knows?
That's true.
Really, I say Stephen Harper, the prime minister, should resign after the next election, but I kind of thought that after the last election.
Yeah.
I was like, it's 2011, he did well, he finally got the majority, now you can resign, confident in a job well done.
I'm sure people thought the same about Gaddafi, too. Interestingly, though, the polls are looking
bizarre.
Not like they ever have before. It's a three-way tie, more or less, although the NDP, yes, keeps slightly tiny bits of momentum gaining.
Yeah, that's how they do it. They slowly, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, like an optical illusion almost. They suddenly, and then they're in the government. And who knows how that happened.
Well, ever since...
that or they just get all the votes within a couple weeks. But, one or the other.
Yeah. The NDP is having a lot of really, lots of good momentum. Mulcair is actually putting some pretty good policy ideas forward, and saying things that
it's nice. It's nice to see the party actually have a platform this time.
Yes,
that's great.
It's really good.
That didn't happen here in BC.
Nope.
There wasn't actually a platform at all.
Yeah.
They've picked a few things: the daycare stuff, pharmacare being a part of the medical system, or drugs, or however that's supposed to work. The $15 minimum wage, although that's for only federal people,
right.
Which is like this weird gray area where no one, barely anyone works, in a federal area, for the federal government, so it doesn't apply to any of the provinces.
What?
Well, it's a federal minimum wage. It would only apply to federal employees.
So you can't literally just have a federal minimum wage?
No, it wouldn't apply to any of the particular provinces. They get to set their own minimum wage.
It sounded a lot better than it actually would be. I thought, like maybe the people making $10 an hour here would now be making.
Well, I mean, the provincial NDP here says they want to bring it up to $15. Alberta's sort of saddling up to that idea as well. I mean, that's part of their platform, but implementing it is sort of the question now.
Yeah, that's true. Especially with the oil sector having just took a dump.
Yeah. Well. Hey, we always complain about the pipelines and whatever. I guess capitalism solves that question for us.
Yeah, right.
Just taking a gigantic, dive into a ditch, as it were.
Yeah, they're done.
There's no money. How about that? No, we don't have to worry about the pipelines.
Yeah, well, apparently in Alberta, the NDP has had to revise some of its platform because when they inherited the government from the Conservatives, they found all these skeletons in the closet, and wow, this budget really doesn't look like what it was described to us before. So.
Well, I mean, that's a fine thing to say, and I have sympathy for them, I guess, but it was a major plank of their campaign that the progressive Conservatives were lying about the budget.
That's a good point.
They apparently knew about this going into it, I mean, did they think that the progressive Conservatives were slashing funding or planning to slash funding to all those things just because? They're like, we've had enough time and power. Let's piss everyone off.
Well, it sure seemed that way.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Nevertheless.
At least the Wild Rose didn't get in.
Yeah, they're mental.
Some of them. They've been trying desperately to, try to get away from their old mental image of the past. They haven't done a stellar job.
And by past, you mean last year?
Well, I mean last month, really.
Yeah.
Candidates saying inflammatory things about minorities, or the age of the earth, or the existence of global warming. Just this crazy stuff that in this country, at least, even in Alberta, can make you completely unelectable.
Instantaneously.
Yeah, pretty much overnight. I mean, in the last election, what was it, 2011 or 10, was it? Where they looked like they were going to form the government in Alberta, and then they ended up completely, falling on their face.
Yeah, that's true. Right in the last, weeks of the campaign, and that was a disaster for them. Yeah. And it looked like they were going to win. So, and that's another reason why, when we see that the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP federally are all in a, statistical dead heat, as it were. I mean, the polls can be remarkably inaccurate sometimes, for starters, and second of all, can change, at the drop of a hat.
I read from all those very intelligent people who were relying on those polls for the BC election and the Alberta election, and their point was the polls were completely accurate. They just weren't representing reality. You can't blame them for following the polls. The polls were just not true.
Well, in the Alberta case, they were.
No, well, they were still protecting either a Wild Rose minority or a PC minority, and neither happened.
No, I remember that a lot of the pollsters correctly predicted the NDP majority. It was I remember reading it. And,
no, I'm talking about not the last election, the one before that.
Oh, right. Okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I was referring to the one.
Oh no, this one they were very careful about this one. I mean, they had the polls consistently saying the NDP was going to form a majority government, and they were all sort of wringing their hands, going, "Well, I don't want to be a liar tomorrow, so the polls say this, but I'm not going to say anything."
Yeah. In any event, I mean, it is federally. It is looking like the Liberals are gradually shedding support steadily.
Well,
I wouldn't quite say hemorrhaging.
We can blame it on one major thing recently.
C-51.
Oh yeah.
What
a goddamn idiotic fucking thing to do.
Yeah, I have to say, seeing on Reddit the Liberal guy who tore up, cut his Liberal membership card in half, and took a picture of it with the pair of scissors, thanks, Justin Trudeau. See you later. Goes and joins the NDP. That warmed my heart. I was so happy to see that.
It's important to keep this in mind as well. They're currently at their lowest level of support since I think the month before Justin Trudeau became leader.
So
basically all of that's done. All of that's gone.
Yeah, it's he looked incredibly buffoonish.
Well, it wasn't just that. It was so like calculating, Machiavellian. Like he was saying publicly and honestly, we're going to vote for this even though we don't want it because we don't want the Conservatives to use it against us during debates in the election.
Yeah, that is literally...
That was his argument. We can take this out of the political arena by voting for it because we all agree, so therefore it's not an issue anymore. And it's like, yeah, but you don't want it, do you? And it's like, well, that doesn't matter. We'll reform it after the election. We promise. Sure, we voted for reforms that we thought were necessary and they didn't go through, but we voted for it anyway. And it's like, what the hell? Why even show up to Parliament if that's your attitude? Why even, like, that was, like, one of the major questions. What's the point of voting for a Liberal who, even when faced with a clear-cut issue like this, where you're saying, this is something I find objectionable, they'll still vote for it?
Just because it's politically convenient?
And he demanded that from his whole party. He used the...
Party whip?
Yeah, he used the party whip for that. It wasn't even a moral issue. It wasn't even a, vote your conscience kind of thing, which they usually use to try to get out of being responsible for their own actions.
Yeah, I was astounded. I mean, I shouldn't say that, though, because there's a general misconception in the Canadian public, I think, that we have three left-wing parties, and the left is fragmented, and, we have a united right conservative party. That is true to an extent, because there used to be two conservative parties, and ever since they merged, they've dominated politics.
2 or 3.
Yes, depending if you count the Christian Heritage Party.
No, not them.
Oh, the Reform
Party
right,
Alliance
sure.
And the other one, the Progressive Conservatives.
Yeah, well, and the Conservatives
Progressive
have melded,
Conservatives.
they've melded together into this amorphous giant Conservative Party, which is dominating, and people left of them, like say people in the Liberal
every
Party,
other large party.
Yeah, everyone else is left of them basically, and so that I think creates the false impression that the Liberals, say, and the Green Party for that matter, are left wing. Sure. Because in my opinion, neither of them are. They're both. I mean, the Greens have their environmental thing, and that's usually associated with left wing politics, but I don't think it necessarily should be. They are totally in favor of balancing the budget on the backs of the working poor. They want to cut healthcare and education funding in order to be more fiscally responsible, whatever the fuck that means. And so
it's like environmental responsibility. They're big on responsibility. They want to be responsible for anything.
Sure. And so I just, in my books, these issues like the environment and gay rights, I'm all for them, but I don't think that's what should define left wing and right wing.
The problem is like a lot of those things, I think, as right wing political parties have taken issue with, say, gay rights or the environment, some of these other things, for more or less just partisan reasons.
Right.
Like, this is what our opponents are in favor of, therefore we will kind of try to court these other voters who are against this kind of stuff.
Right. I think in terms of the Liberals, though...
I mean, never mind, the Alliance was definitely, explicitly against homosexuals and a whole bunch of other things.
Yes.
But now, all that... look, to be fair to the Conservatives, and this is probably not going to be all that fair at all, they have jettisoned most of their principles for the sake of power.
Yes.
That was the whole point of merging all of those right-wing parties together.
Yeah. And
to be able to get into power and stay in power as long as possible, no matter the cost.
Yeah.
And that's it. And that's where we are now. Now, and it's not to say that they haven't done things that I find, awful, but I think it's a mistake to treat Stephen Harper as some kind of, Manchurian candidate who was secretly this ultra right-wing fascist all along.
Right.
When personally I think he's a right-wing sock puppet whose job essentially, whose existence depends on his ability to keep the Conservatives in power. And that's why so much power has been invested in him personally, and he's been able to basically run the party like a dictator.
Yeah, which he has done very well.
Yeah, because as long as he can keep the party in power, if they end up in the opposition or, God forbid, third party status, he's out, and the Conservative Party might just break into pieces again.
It probably would.
Because why wouldn't it? Because all of those issues like abortion and gay marriage and all these things that the different factions of the party want to have a much more aggressive stance on. He explicitly says we will have no stance on it. We will not talk about this, and anyone who does is out.
Yeah, and that all depends on Stephen Harper being the leader.
Yeah.
As soon as he's gone, then those issues will come right to the forefront. Because you have those, like, foaming at the mouth backbenchers who all they want to do is be homophobic bigots and talk about how, they should reinstate the death penalty and get rid of abortion. And not a lot of...
That's an interesting combination of ideas, considering the arguments behind both of them.
Yeah, pro-life? Wait a second.
Pro-families and pro-death.
Yeah, when you put those ideas right next to each other, it's... Wait a second. That's cognitive dissonance right there. Anyway, I think... in continuing what I was saying earlier, I think that the Liberals should be considered a right-wing party too. Mm-hmm. They are right of center, at least. Like, they are much better on, social issues and stuff, but if we're talking about economic issues, then the Liberals are, they haven't supported the NDP's childcare policy. They still agree with tax positions for the wealthy that the Conservatives have already sorted out, and subsidies for big companies, that sort of thing. Like, he sides with the Conservatives on all these economic issues. Like, if we're talking about...
To be fair, though, they do feel really bad about it when they vote for those things that they totally, trust us this time, they don't want.
Right.
I guess that's the choice the Liberals are offering as far as compared to the Conservatives is it's a choice between an aggressively anti, working class, anti poverty, anti poor people stance, and the Liberal Party, which will do it, but will feel really bad about it, and will tell you, it's like, we don't want to cut these services, but we have to, and I'm so sorry. It's not part of some scheme or a plan. We don't have plans. We just do what we have to do, and it just so happens it tends to hurt, the poorest in society.
Yeah. So they seem so much more reasonable, but yet
they're absolutely
doing
more reasonable.
The same thing.
It's it's a different tactic for business, for capitalists in the country. You've got two different ways of addressing essentially the same problem. Do you go about it by trying to kind of court people and convince them and sort of bring them on your side and then basically do what you wanted to do in the first place? Or do you basically do what the Conservatives have done, which is just tell people, we don't really care if you agree with us. We're going to do this anyway, and it's for your own good, and you don't understand how this works. You don't understand the issues, and the public doesn't need to be consulted or really a part of this process at all. Which, the current Prime Minister has kind of mastered the art of being obtuse about his actions.
Yeah, well, he's even gone so far as to brand people that criticize and protest against his economic policies as literally terrorists. So,
sure, but what was it? It was Vic Taves who criticized, who said to people in Parliament that anyone who criticized his cybersecurity bill was siding with the pedophiles.
Siding with child pornographers, I believe was the word he used.
Yeah. So that's hardly out of left field for them, eh?
Yeah. That they do it all the time. But now that it's not just some idiotic thing that they say in Parliament, this is now law. The Senate passed C-51.
Yep.
And
the only time the only time anyone had recently cared about the Senate at all, considering what they've been mired in for the last couple of years.
Yeah, under like constant criminal investigation now, and you know they still could.
They could have they for the first time in like forever.
My life,
yeah,
like,
I
in
guess
my memory,
since I can think of, really, they could have like said, here is why we exist. This is the reason.
Yes, we are the. That's what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be this quote unquote sober afterthought of, and it's like, listen, you can't even block this fucking bill,
slow it down, or even debate it some more, or whatever.
That shreds the Charter of Rights and Freedoms into a indecipherable.
It just provides a lot of workarounds. Okay, it doesn't. The Charter's still there, but it's more like it's there in the sense of like much more of an abstract concept, not really something that would apply or restrict the actions of the government.
Yes, it's like it's a nice thought, you know, but none of it actually applies.
Assuming
anymore.
There's no contrary evidence, then charter. Which is funny because with the notwithstanding clause, the government can violate the charter anytime it wants.
Really?
Yeah. The notwithstanding clause allows for I think it's any part of the charter except for the electoral laws to be violated.
I thought that was only to do with Quebec separating.
No, anyone can do it.
Really?
Anyone at all, at any level of government.
So it can just say like, "Oh, this is too important, so we're just using."
Yep, you can do that. You can say what the thing about it is is in theory it's considered like too politically damaging to explicitly violate the charter in that way.
Right. Yeah,
so you would only do it in, say, an emergency. Although I think it was used in Winnipeg once to resolve a labor dispute or something in Manitoba. I don't really remember the details of that, but no, it was primarily only ever used in Quebec. But even then, for the separatist government in Quebec at the time, it was more used as like a symbolic thing.
Wait, no. Wasn't it that it wasn't used? They were only going to use it to block the Quebec separation if it passed.
Oh, that? No. I mean, the Parti Québécois apparently was using it in their laws even when they didn't need to, because sort of as I think it was like as a protest against the charter.
Right.
Like we don't. This is not we don't want to be under the charter even if it doesn't really matter one way or the other.
Right. Interesting.
But no one's really ever used it in any kind of explicit way. Like no one's ever, like the government of Canada can legally, any provincial or federal government can say, we're going to make it illegal for demonstrations, like altogether. They're just illegal.
Right.
That you can do that, and all you have to do is say, notwithstanding the charter, blah blah blah, and you just put that like boilerplate at the front of your law, and you can do that. The only other thing about it is I think it gives it like it puts like a time limit on any laws, so they only can last for a couple of years if they use the notwithstanding clause.
Right. Well, that's nice. That was.
I guess. I mean, it's. Well, to be fair, I mean, you compare this to other countries where, look, let's be serious here for a second. The Charter of Rights or the Bill of Rights or any kind of like legal code isn't nearly as powerful as it's played up as. It is like with Bill C-51 is a perfect example. It is possible to violate those principles and still basically be allowed to write laws. Like there isn't this kind of explicit blockage to.
Right.
Quote unquote illegal or uncharter like legislation.
So it's not like the American Constitution at all, where it's like sacrosanct and never will be changed.
The interesting thing about that, personally,
clause.
I think that it's actually better to do it this way because it allows for violations of the charter. It allows for it. It says like this will happen, and here's the process for doing that. Instead of in the United States or in really a lot of other countries, this isn't even really a particular thing, where violations happen, but they're kind of papered over as not really. Like you just redefine things.
Right.
So it just becomes more dishonest and more hypocritical and just burying the truth of the matter, which in the case of our system, it is possible to explicitly violate the charter and do it in an open and honest way.
Huh.
Which isn't necessarily good or bad, but it just is like, I think one of the major signs of our times is that kind of like hypocrisy.
Right.
in politics, where, enemy combatants are just redefined as any male over the age of 16.
Right.
That kind of stuff. And then you can kill them, right? Because they're enemy combatants. Instead of saying, we're going to kill anyone, and we're going to do it openly and honestly. Like, they're just, because there isn't a process for doing that, because that's illegal.
Right, because the Geneva Conventions, etc.
Yeah, and a bunch of other laws and just sort of principles apply.
Well, the Canadian political system is a lot more, I find, dynamic and stable than the Americans. I mean, because there are those exceptions like that, and there are we have governments that right now, for example, and in some cases this is bad. Like, the Conservatives have a majority, and they literally do whatever they want, regardless as to what the public thinks. And that's sort of like the alternative to the American system, where nothing gets done ever because everyone is vetoing each other and bickering and arguing and etc. And we do plenty of bickering and arguing, but I think in the Canadian case, we at least acknowledge that something needs to be done. The government needs to do things. And in the current government, I think the things that they do are awful and heinous and deplorable. But, if the NDP, hopefully, fingers crossed, takes power, I, in siding with them, would like to see them have the ability to actually implement their platform.
Well, in the most likely scenario, it becomes a minority government. I mean, that is with the numbers where they are right now, if that stays even a fair bit stable, it'll probably be Conservative, Liberal, or NDP minority government.
Yeah, that's true.
But I mean, that just gets to kind of another core issue for the Canadian political system, which is our understanding of what the government is.
Right.
Like, we tend to see the government as the party in power running everything else. A lot of other countries see those political parties as more like administrators, like the American administration, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Where their job isn't really to be the government, it's to just sort of be custodians for it, to maintain it, and as an institution that sort of runs all on its own. Whereas our system is a bit more, the attitude is, no, when you get into power, you have all the power and you can do whatever you want as far as you can, given the laws.
We'll see advertisements on television that will be like clear propaganda pieces, and it says, brought to you by the government of Canada.
Yep.
When it's clearly brought to you by the Conservative Party, but they are the government. So
yeah, they're the government.
They're not
and
technically
the government
lying.
Needs to be, as I say, in the next election, the government will most likely be overthrown. That will happen, and a new government will be formed. And we do it all the time, and it's really not all that amazing, because what's meant by the government is something a lot more vague and kind of maybe even old-fashioned than in a lot of other countries.
Yeah, that's true. Most Canadians, I think, if I remember correctly, some 2/3 of us are in favor of coalition government, just to get rid of the Conservatives. And it's funny, Thomas Mulcair is all for it, and Justin, in a not
it's weird.
In a pragmatic sort of way.
It's one of those things where what is meant by a coalition is never really clearly defined, and it depends on the polls that week on what people are willing to say.
Sure, but I mean, more importantly, who would be Prime Minister then? Justin Trudeau or Mulcair? I suppose it would depend on who got more seats. Well,
maybe. Currently, right now, the votes, the way the votes work out, the NDP in the last poll that I read had 0.5 fewer percentage of votes, but I think got 3 more seats than the Liberals.
Really?
So what would happen then? They have a couple more seats and have slightly fewer votes.
That would be a shit show.
It would be like, well, what do you do?
Do you want to flip a coin or what? Because it could go either way.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, governments in Canada have been formed. There was one case in the Maritimes. I think it was in the 90s. Christ, I can't remember. Anyway, the Liberals got 100% of the seats in Parliament, in spite of only getting about 2/3 of the vote, because that's how every...
Yeah, well, it's first past the post, that whole deal.
Yeah, which, by the way, is another thing Mulcair has said, that he wants to institute
I know.
proportional
He also said
representation.
he's going to abolish the Senate regardless of he said he's going to look into abolishing the Senate regardless of the constitutional issues that would involve.
Notwithstanding clause, woo!
Well, I don't know. Well, yeah.
Could you do that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that would be included under government or how that would work. The simplest way apparently is to completely defund them. And remove all of them from office.
Right.
You can do that, right? You can say you're all out on your ass and we're not paying you any money, and then have a single Senate member just rubber stamp everything without any just appoint someone, and it doesn't matter. And just get rid of everyone else and have that appointment be an unpaid position. And that's it. And then essentially the Senate's gone.
I like that. That's clever.
And that doesn't require... But the problem with that, of course, is, that's kind of a loophole.
Yeah, well,
it would be nice to just get rid of it. I mean, it's one of those funny things where it's we can't just abolish it. That would just be crazy. But we can essentially abolish it because it's just a, series of sort of traditions and rules that we agree to.
Yeah.
But whatever. That is the problem with the Westminster system, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that proportional representation would be a good thing. Most countries in Europe do it. The argument in Canada against it is that we're very large.
Yeah, it's a large country, diverse both culturally. I mean, the country is divided in so many different ways.
Yeah.
How would you be able to, address all of those divisions? The West versus the East, the urban versus countryside.
French and English,
the coastal areas versus the interior, the north of the country, the Arctic versus, where people live.
Yeah, that's true.
Toronto versus everyone.
I guess in this case it would probably be the Arctic versus Alberta and the tar sands, because they're kind of screwing with their climate quite a bit.
No, actually, apparently, if they'll probably have more arable land in 50 years than Saskatchewan will have.
Really?
I don't know, maybe. I know the Yukon apparently has, based on some projections, will have a lot of arable land within 50, 60, 70 years. Which will be just in time for the G7 to finally do something about global warming.
And they promise that they'll actually do something this time, guys.
Here's the problem. When you start picking years that sound like some kind of science fiction future land, I'm getting a bit skeptical.
What, Angela Merkel saying that by 2100?
Yeah. By 2150, we shall have invented a means of controlling the weather. I read that book. Yeah, sure. It was great.
Yeah, I mean, they all sort of know that they're all there just to give the... And we're talking about, for those who haven't picked up on this, there was recently a G7 conference and held in a castle, and
lightning striking in the background.
They were all, saying they're gung-ho about reducing carbon emissions.
Just not before they're all dead.
Yes. Someone else after us should do this. Look, but it's too politically
we looked at the numbers
now.
And we said, okay, we're all going to be dead. We're definitely all going to be dead by at least 2080. So
give us another 20 years just in case.
After that, 20 years is plenty of time. We'll be able to figure it out. Whatever. We need to do this for our grandchildren, i.e., leave it for our grandchildren to do.
Yeah, that's about right. And but props to Stephen Harper for being honest and just saying no, we're not doing anything about this. I can't believe I actually just said those words.
I love how every time the federal government comes out with any kind of environmental policy, it explicitly excludes the tar sands.
Yeah.
It's such a ridiculous thing to even bother with. Why not just have an even worse environmental policy that does include the tar sands? Because at least that would be kind of conceptually consistent. It's not like the tar sands don't exist in the world of, pollution.
Yeah.
They're there. They're actually there. I mean, they're not gone. You don't just get to be like, oh yeah, well, we just forgot. We just crossed them off the ledger, and now we're fine.
Yeah, they don't count. In fact, though, it's kind of like having a pissing section in a swimming pool. You can't really do that.
Pissing section. Well, that's the children's pool, isn't it?
Well,
We all know that that's the children's pool. We agree implicitly, and similarly, we agree implicitly that, the tar sands will be horribly polluting, and no one will like it, and no one wants to live there.
Yeah. Well, except people that are,
People who were making money.
Yeah, that's right. Until
I'm so
I
sorry.
have to
That's
say,
awful, man. I mean, they're talking about like the loss of 160,000 jobs because of this.
Really?
Yeah.
Jesus.
I mean, even if that estimate's partially off, it's still a lot of people who are being kicked to the curb because of things that had nothing to do with them.
I hate to say this, but I do think that some Canadians express some level of schadenfreude to seeing Alberta's economy sort of take a dump now.
Yeah. So do we have any? Do we have any have provinces anymore?
That's a good question.
I mean, it's the average, right? But sort of.
Everyone's doing pretty poorly.
So is it just kind of?
But haves and have-nots is a relative term.
Within like the margin of error at this point, and everyone's just kind of eh.
So are we all going to be? We can't all wait. No, it's based on who contributes more and who takes more.
But who is left? Who is in that bracket now?
Right. That's a good. And that's why we're projecting a recession, I guess.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's the other thing that happened recently. Projecting a recession, just like the rest of the world, Abby.
Yeah. Well.
How about that?
We can join the club with like all 200 others.
Yeah. It's just I don't know. The economy is a mess, and let's be honest here. Most of our politicians want to pretend like it's not their fault. So we're all left with kind of this. We're all left with political leaders who like to talk about the economy a lot, but generally don't like to talk about like anything bad happening while they're around. Even when it's stuff that, to be serious, isn't their fault. Like the fall in the price of oil wasn't the fault of the progressive conservatives in Alberta. It had nothing to do with them at all. They were victims of that whole disaster. I don't really have much sympathy for them, but nevertheless, it wasn't actually anything they did in particular. Well, it wasn't the fall in oil, it was all those cuts that they were trying to make to try to quickly make up the difference after years of mismanagement. But ultimately, these are people who often don't really, for all that they talk about business and how the government should be run like a business, they don't really ever do that.
Fortunately?
Well, fortunately or not, but they tend to just run the business. They tend to run the quote business of government into a deficit.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah. Interestingly, the people on the right end of the spectrum are the ones that claim to have the authority over economic management and competence, and yet the NDP consistently has had better balanced budgets almost in every case. But it's a misconception that the public has.
I don't think it's a. I don't think it's a misconception so much as it's an attempt at convincing everyone else of the benefits of such a government.
Right.
Because a right-wing government is better for big business.
Yes.
So big businesses are going to return the favor and tell the whole public and everyone they can about how wonderful they are.
Sure, and that gives a lot
even if they lose money. In like the government can lose all the money it wants as long as capitalism's making money.
Yeah, and
that's the issue.
And what's funny is they've been making so much money that they now have $600 billion, gathering dust in bank vaults.
For a rainy day.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe there's going to be a recession. We can't predict these things.
That I find completely patently absurd, that we're headed towards a recession in the economy, and there is literally $600 billion just sitting there.
Yeah, but it's not ours. It's someone else's.
And that is the absurdity of capitalism.
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah, and it's just like, I can't wrap my head around this.
They look at the world, they look at the entire world, and they think, there's nothing I want to put my money into. And if that's not an indictment of capitalism, I don't know what is.
No shit. Yeah, no kidding. I just think it's crazy. I also think that like one thing, and this is my own idea.
Oh dear.
That no political parties are talking about, but I maybe this is the chance to get this idea out there. I think that any party, including the Conservatives, could win the next election solely by taking on the telecommunications cartel in Canada. Companies like Bell and Shaw and like all of them are universally reviled. Everybody has complete vitriol for them, like just hatred. They've been screwed over by every one of these companies, and they like if you had a political party that came forward and said, "Listen, we are going to do whatever.
We're going to nationalize the telecommunications industry."
Well, that's what the NDP would do, but I mean, the Conservatives could, or the Liberals could put their own ideas forward.
Well,
and
okay,
people
but
would love that.
The problem is, from within the context of the Liberals and Conservatives, within what they conceptually think they're able to do, what can they do with the telecommunications industry? Introduce regulations?
The Conservatives tried.
The Conservatives didn't try. They tried to appear like they were trying.
Yes, okay. But, I mean...
And we knew that, so realistically, they were only attempting to try to appear like they were trying.
So, was it that... Because what they did was they put a bunch of broadband spectrum on, up for auction.
Yep.
And I think they were going to allow some foreign companies to buy into the market, which is crazy, but anyway... they didn't even want to invest because it's like, well, why would we invest in an industry here that is literally run by a cartel of companies?
Yeah, they just get forced out of the market.
Yeah, there's no way to compete unless you're awesome and tech savvy.
Well, I mean, there's small companies that do all sorts of things that are they kind of workarounds for all this, but ultimately we're talking about even the workarounds rely on one of these cartels to be willing to farm out their own network.
Oh, it's true. Yeah, small ISPs like Tech Savvy and Juice, I think is another one, and there's a few others. They all piggyback off of their networks. It's too fucking expensive to build your own infrastructure.
Well, sure.
So, I think that when you have these companies that are already this large, you would probably need to have something like a nationalization. It would make so much more sense if we consider that the internet should be treated like a public utility,
like the roads, or a highway, for instance. A conceptual metaphor. If we were to refer, for instance, to the internet as some kind of information highway that we used to connect to people,
right?
For instance,
that's good. I like that. Did you just think of that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's now law in the United States that it's a public utility, but when I think of a public utility, I don't equate that with a private company. It's the kind of thing that you sell to people at cost because it's public and just a public good.
Well,
so if you had a national company. If the Canadian government nationalized at least some of the infrastructure, they could create a service that was way fucking cheaper than what's on the market right now, sell it at cost, and people will come to it in droves.
Sure. And I mean, I agree with you. And the other thing is just that it wouldn't even need to be a socialist position. I mean, red Tory politics, which is kind of gone now, expunged from the Conservative Party. The whole idea of that was that you create those kinds of institutions to help capitalism function better.
Right.
Because, you have these standard social services or economic services, electricity, water, and so on, controlled by the government and provided at cost in order for business to flourish.
Right.
And I think there's no better example in the modern case, at least, than having, say, the internet available to everyone at cost or for free or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Just as a matter of course. If you could do that and no more worrying about all this, the companies not wanting to update bandwidth because it's not worth it, you just do that because, it's good for business, which it would be. Unfortunately, though, the time period in which we live in just happens to be kind of not quite that thoughtful about the economy.
Nope. It's expensive. Cut it back.
Cost
Get rid
money.
of it.
Well, and
be more productive.
Once again, to be fair, if we're talking purely about profit making, then those companies are perfectly happy where they are. The issue of customer service satisfaction and bandwidth is completely irrelevant.
What's funny is this is a bit of a this is going into American politics, but there's a study done. I think it was by Forbes or The Economist, I can't remember, but they compared customer satisfaction versus profits, and they found that not only were they related, but in the sense that the businesses that had worse customer satisfaction made more money.
Negative correlation.
It has a negative correlation, and the best example of that is Comcast. They are the most hated company probably on the face of the planet. They are just universally reviled. And they make shitloads of money because they don't waste money on pleasing their customers.
It makes business sense. All that talk about the future, the technological wonderland future we'll be living in, where everyone is happy and can communicate with each other, is not something that will just happen.
Yeah,
it's not something where you can just be like, oh, it all fits together. All the interests are all moving in one direction. There are conflicting interests here.
Yeah, diametrically opposed. And just like every other period in human history, we have had to fight tooth and nail for every inch of progress. I actually am a bit disappointed that not any of the political parties in Canada have even mentioned this issue. I think it's something that affects everyone, mostly everyone on a day-to-day basis.
Says the guy who works on the internet for a living.
Sure, and I am obviously biased, but I might work there, but other people do their banking there and spend a lot of time on the internet surfing and whatnot, and a lot of Canada does have an IT industry.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
Et cetera.
Yeah, get off your soapbox. All right, the internet's great. We all agree. Who cares?
Okay, but my point is that I would like to see some political party at least address the issue of the telecommunications
It would be
cartel.
nice to see, wouldn't it? I mean, with the Conservatives being in power for the last 8 years, the list of things I would like to see discussed in Parliament has been getting longer and longer.
Yeah.
They're just not very good at talking about anything or debating anything. I mean, the whole pretext of convincing the public or presenting your ideas is gone. It's just sort of here's an omnibus bill. What's in it? Well, our members haven't really read it, so we're just going to vote for it anyway. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, it's just a thing they have to do to get there. It's like the public and their positions and feelings about things are just seen as an inconvenience.
And I think
I
think it has, at least the Conservatives, it has bitten them in the ass a bit. Like, their treatment not just of the public but of the media and journalists has been surprisingly bad.
Yeah, even for what I would expect of them.
Like, they've been really insulting to journalists.
Yeah, they
many
just
times
seem them like they're just an inconvenience. Like, what you want me to explain our policies to you? Who are you to ask me that? Like, well, that's literally my job as a journalist.
Or they just read off some white paper on whatever thing they're doing, and then they ask questions, and none of the questions get answered, because why would you?
Yeah. And it's funny the degree of cynicism with which, particularly, I think, CBC and other organizations
even
treat them.
The National Post, Globe and Mail. There's really not. I don't think there's any paper that is in favor of the Conservatives anymore, so much as they're just don't vote Liberal or NDP, so you're gonna have to just vote Conservative anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is not exactly a clarion call for the future. Which, of course, is what Stephen Harper was elected on. That whole idea of open government and accountability and an end to corruption and all that sort of stuff. That was what he was elected on. The whole beginning of his career. And it's so funny because now in literally in this country, most of the attack ads on Stephen Harper simply involve quoting Stephen Harper from 10 years ago.
Yep, that sounds about right.
That's it. It's just like, well, here's the Stephen Harper that used to exist. Now here's this modern day monster that he turned into. What happened?
Well, on the other hand, and I don't mean to seem like I'm making an argument in favor of Stephen Harper, but what government hasn't been elected on destroying the corruption and like being more accountable and blah blah blah?
Fair
to
enough.
me, that's just boilerplate. Like,
Well, yeah, but you had the
politician
whole sponsorship scandal thing, massive corruption scandal.
speak. Liberals
with the Liberals in Quebec.
Yeah.
All that sort of stuff.
What year was that again?
I don't know, 2004, 6, something like that.
Right.
I can't remember exactly because there was they lost election, they became a minority government, they ran again, and they kept like replacing leaders for a while until eventually they eventually got into the 2011 election where they got completely shellacked.
Wasn't it 2006?
2011 was the last one where they really
11.
got hit hard.
Right. Sorry. I thought you said
2006, and I think there was one in 2008. And yeah. But anyway, it's basically since 2008, I guess. Maybe it's 2007. It doesn't matter. The point is that the Liberals were unseated explicitly because of a major scandal involving corruption and graft.
And now
The Conservatives
Stephen
come into
Harper-
power saying, we will clean up Ottawa, we will, introduce these great ideas and all that sort of stuff. Not really. They didn't really rise to the position because of like some kind of shift in the Canadian political consciousness, so much as just at the time they were seen as the only legitimate means of sort of punishing the Liberals for their crimes, essentially.
And here's another nice little nuance about the Canadian political system. Every instance in the last few years where a alternative government might have been formed or there might have been some serious debate or a non-confidence motion, Stephen Harper has just conveniently shut down Parliament and avoided voting on
but that was
things.
during minority governments. He hasn't had to do that for a while.
Yeah, that's true.
Proroguing Parliament is an old trick, man. That's old news. Come on. It barely even matters anymore.
Well, now that he has a majority, sure, but
And once again,
don't you think it's like the embodiment of cynicism?
it's a legal tactic that he can use. It's like a filibuster, except it's the exact opposite of a filibuster. He just shuts down the whole process instead of
prolonging it
indefinitely, which we don't generally allow. Well, I don't think we allow filibusters at all, really, in Parliament. They're actually
That's like an American thing, isn't it?
They're timed. You can actually just stop them, pretty much.
Right.
You can it's possible, say, to extend debate, for instance, to rally support against a particular piece of legislation or whatever. But
none of that matters in a majority government.
well, it kind of matters in the sense that every one of those things really undermines the faith people have in the Conservative Party.
Right.
But ultimately, like day to day, it's not really a huge thing. We pretend like the Conservatives are just voting for their own laws all the time, always. But I mean, the fact of the matter is Parliament is doing a lot of inconsequential stuff as well that they're perfectly happy to work together on.
Great.
Just boring nonsense that Parliament just has to do.
Aren't worth taking positions on.
Yeah, apolitical issues.
Yeah. Well, great. At least they can.
At least they can agree on the things that don't matter.
Sure.
Usually, unless they have an axe to grind.
I read an interesting article lately that was talking about how fixed election dates have changed the way that, because we used to have where like an election could just be called.
Well, we still do.
Right.
Technically.
If there's a non-confidence
No. Most of it is still. You can basically call them whenever you want. The way it works is that the government now, most governments are now starting to try to have fixed election dates, so they declare ahead of time that that's when they're going to do it.
Right.
So it's not so much that they could call one earlier, but it would be seen as really fucking obscene.
Right. Anyway, the fact that we have this fixed election of October 22nd, it sort of the campaign for the election has already unofficially started. You know,
Well, it isn't even unofficial anymore. It's like they're already talking about they're in a campaign. There's a campaign. There's an election.
But the interesting thing is that Harper meddled with the campaign finance stuff, where we used to. The federal government would pay political parties for the amount of votes that they received, right? So if you were more popular, the money that you got in funding was reflective of your popular support.
You didn't get. You're not allowed to get money from. I think it's like corporate or union entities, like essentially non-individuals.
Yeah. And so now
and in addition to that, you would get money from essentially the federal government based on the number of votes you got. So if you were a minority party and you didn't elect anyone, but you got, say, 40,000 votes, that would translate into some money for your party to, say, do political research or whatever.
Yeah, and it made sense, but Harper scrapped that, and it just so happens that now, your average person that votes conservative is usually much more wealthy and well-off than your average person.
Well, demographics.
No, the numbers do reflect that.
No, the liberals generally get the more well-educated, wealthy people. Really, like the highest educated and wealthy.
Well, if you look at if you break the Canadian political sympathies down into 4 categories, where you have the poorest quadrant, highest quadrant. You know, the 2 middle quadrants. It's like basically. It could be liberal, NDP, conservative. It's basically
dead heat.
But with the highest income bracket of 20%, this support for the conservatives is obviously the highest. It's like way higher than the others.
Okay.
And for the poorest quadrant, it's the exact opposite, where they support the NDP. And so now that the political parties are not getting money from their popular support and they're relying on individual donors, your average conservative donor is going to have a shitload more money and can afford to support them way more than your average NDP voter, right? So now that we have these elections that are going on way longer, before when we had elections that were only 37 days long and that's it, and you were given an allowance of money that you could spend, and that was it. You were not legally allowed to spend more. But now that elections are going on longer, and he's meddled with the way that it's funded, that the Conservative Party is basically rigging this in their own favor, where they can sort of unofficially, they have more money and can spend more money than is, used to have been allowed. And so their own meddling with the rules is all just for their own favor and to make it artificially more difficult for other parties.
No, look, it might have overall benefit them, but I think comparing that to, say, their use of the government as just a propaganda mouthpiece for projects that they are maybe thinking of doing, like on TV and stuff, they're just paying for ads with public funds.
Right.
Like that sort of stuff is way more significant than this kind of middling sort of number fudging. The real problem is the question of when does the election actually start, and how does that relate to funding? Because there are limits on the amount of money you can spend in any particular riding.
Right.
So how does that relate to an election that can last, say, 4 months?
Yeah, how does that even work?
I don't know, and it doesn't seem like there's a clear answer to that. I assume there will actually be because it hasn't happened yet, but there will actually be a date in Parliament when Parliament closes and the election officially starts.
Right.
But right now, it's basically just a free-for-all.
Off the books.
Well, it's not off the books, but it just is a free-for-all. You're spending money in ridings, but it doesn't really count because an election isn't currently occurring.
Yeah.
Which may or may not make a difference, because I think ultimately those last 37 days are going to be the most decisive ones, particularly considering the way in which the numbers have been working, with all 3 parties so close together.
Yeah. That's true.
But that gets into the whole issue of the debates and things, where the Conservatives aren't going to be directly debating the other parties.
That's right. I mean, they saw how the debates in Alberta completely fucked over the Conservatives, where the debates were the definitive moment where Alberta saw the NDP and
I
was
think
they are
they're-
viable.
Well, I think they're. The thing is the Conservatives are going to be debating the other parties,
but
right?
not in the traditional platform that reaches the
Well,
most amount of people.
they're not going to be debating the other parties in front of. I think it was CTV or CBC. That like I don't really understand how this exactly works, but like conglomerates of different news agencies get together and they agree to broadcast these
They're
debates.
doing one with McLean's or something?
Yeah, McLean's and a few other different things. The point is that like the big one they won't be involved in. Well, the biggest one. I mean, the CBC is the news station most Canadians watch, generally, and CTV is like the second biggest or something.
Yeah, and those are the only two that the Conservatives won't take part in because they don't want to embarrass themselves.
Well, maybe.
To
I
the
mean,
most amount of people.
I expect that both CBC and CTV will probably just be like airing, select bits.
No, I think they are going to have a debate just without the Conservatives.
No, I know, but I mean, like later on, the debate with the Conservatives will surely end up in the public, sphere, and whatever.
Well, we have the internet.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. Is like whatever mistakes they make, whatever flubs they make, will be there and available. I don't think that this is going to be nearly as effective as they think it will be.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And ultimately, I mean, if let's say, for instance, during the big debate, all the other parties do is talk about how the Conservatives are a bunch of cowards, then it'll be bad for them too.
That's very true.
They can be like, well, let's put aside our differences for the next 45 minutes and just talk about why the Conservatives aren't there. Apparently, they want to have an empty chair on stage for Stephen Harper, who won't be there.
What about a cardboard cutout?
That would be good, too.
Just to take
that
the
would be
piss.
hilarious.
That would be great.
Like some kind of, like a puppet.
Yeah.
And just, like, play quotes. Like, the generic lines. Like, when people were demanding answers from the government in Parliament, and he would always, like, what was that response? He would say, like, well, I referred the honourable member back to the previous answer.
Right.
It's like, you didn't answer last time. That doesn't mean anything. I want an actual answer. Well, I refer you back to my previous answer. This isn't a fucking game.
Actually, it is.
Well, yeah. I win.
Yeah, well, I do look forward to seeing how the election, progresses from here. I'm really stoked to see the NDP is like viable for the first time ever.
Well, I mean, they're in official opposition. That's not nothing.
That has helped us more than anything. I mean,
Yeah.
like, because now the Liberals are not just by default seen as the default other party, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, this is possible. And especially now that what I find interesting is in Alberta, they elected a NDP government. And
Impossible.
Yeah, unthinkable. But interestingly, still, they are, in terms of federal politics, they're still favoring the Conservatives, which is a bit weird to me.
Less now, though. It's important to point out that the NDP is doing very well in Alberta, relatively.
Sure, but what I find more interesting is that the effect that the NDP win in Alberta has had on the Canadian political psyche is that they could win against all odds, and it's even if the people in Alberta themselves aren't going to vote for NDP federally, the provincial victory of them in Alberta is making it abundantly more likely that people elsewhere in the country are going to, be like, hey, well, maybe they're not so bad.
Well, I guess that's the most interesting thing about Canadian politics is just its ability to surprise people that way. It's I find it interesting. I know a lot of people don't, and a lot of people generally just don't find Canada very interesting. Generally,
Well, they don't live here. They don't.
Even people who live here oftentimes don't find it very interesting.
Yeah, but it's hard to find.
It's one of those things where it's like, I don't understand how anyone could watch the American political process for 6 months, because like nothing happens.
It's the same shit
at all. No, but I mean,
time.
like, even just taking a single election there on its own, nothing happens like 99% of the time. It's just,
filler.
It's just filler. It's just the same things. It's people arguing about nothing. It's It's people taking people taking stats that haven't moved at all and just arguing about them as if it's a big deal. That this latest poll that confirms all the other polls has come out. Whereas in Canadian politics, stuff actually happens. Things change. Ideas are actually like put forward and positions are taken. And sometimes, that's for good and bad, but it is definitely a lot more interesting. And I think it's one of the most interesting political processes like in the world, really.